Chloe is a child in care who, aged 11, alleges that she's been raped.
How is an 11-year-old putting herself at risk when there's an older male preying on her?
The mayor had said there was no reports and there was no indication.
How is the mayor not seeing what is actually happening? They're all part of a massive cover-up.
Child O, she writes a letter to a friend, describes being abducted, taken to a park, beaten and raped.
They didn't even keep the letter. You've just got rid of evidence. DNA's handed over and it's still not enough.
She actually went on to end her own life.
So I tried to kill myself. I couldn't deal with it anymore, walking past my perpetrators every single day.
Girls as young as 14, sold on the streets. Some of those girls were on crack cocaine.
So many police officers in this city, not one of you are protecting us.
They pose a serious risk to children. They believe they are untouchable.
They are getting away with it. They are untouchable. What about the live girls that are living with it every day?
Police are turning a blind eye to this. The parents have gone to the police many, many times and nothing is being...
It doesn't feel bad. That's right. Right?
Yes. Every time. No pedophiles.
Anger spilling onto Britain's streets. A teenager held captive, hundreds of Sikhs on the UK streets, and a dramatic rescue. Putting the spotlight on an issue UK PM Keir Starmer hoped to cover up: the rampant menace of Pakistani grooming gangs.
The ringleader of a grooming gang who raped 2 schoolgirls in Rochdale has been jailed for 35 years. Mohammed Zahid, who's 65, was known as Boss Man and sexually exploited the girls from the age of 13.
And the story of a child groomed and exploited by drugs gangs at the age of 11. An organisation that supports children involved with county lines. That's where youngsters travel up and down the country to deliver drugs, says a greater understanding of how gangs work is needed. Last night on News at 10, we heard about the huge rise in the number of children being recorded as trafficked and exploited by criminal gangs. Well, now...
As an Indian, when I looked into this case and did some research, I wasn't surprised or shocked at all. This is not something new. It has happened many times before. This kind of thing has been going on in India for the last 1300 years, carried out thousands of times by one particular community. One clear example is the 1992 Ajmer rape and blackmail case. And let me tell you, this is not just happening in India. It is happening across the entire world, done by people from that same specific community. For more than 2 decades in the United Kingdom, thousands of young girls, predominantly non-Muslim, including mostly white Christian girls from working class backgrounds, as well as Indian Punjabi Sikh girls and others from various nationalities, were systematically raped, abused, trafficked and silenced. Most of these victims were children, some were as young as 9 to 11 years old and others up to 16 years old. They were groomed using manipulative tactics like giving them gifts, drugs, alcohol and false promises of love and affection. After that, they were controlled, raped and passed around between groups of Pakistani men. These gangs often operated in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oxford and many other places. And yes, the perpetrators were mostly men of Pakistani heritage. Many of them formed organized gangs that took advantage of weaknesses in the child protection system. Official investigation later found that over 1,400 girls were abused in Rotherham alone between 1997 to 2013.
Thousands, and we are talking thousands, of young girls who've had their lives ruined, lost lives.
I wonder if it's thousands, Dawn. I wonder if it's actually not tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And if you do the maths, that means the number of perpetrators will be hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million. If you think about how many times this has happened to each one, each girl who's been violated, it's horrendous. And obviously, the people who have got political careers would actually be some of the perpetrators themselves. Some of the councillors, some of the police officers,
There was one
some of the
councillor
people
certainly accused of being part of one of the gangs, yes.
I mean, if you just think about the numbers and the political careers there, they've got their careers, they're in positions of power. And we know that for so long, this was not just brushed under the carpet.
Across the UK, the total number of victims in documented cases is likely more than 4,000. Police reports were filed many times but were ignored or dismissed. Parents who tried to raise alarms faced threats, intimidation, and even attacks to keep them quiet. Instead of protecting the victims, the authorities often blame them. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the abuse were silenced, demoted, or ignored.
Our conservative estimate is that at least 1,400 individual children in Rotherham were victims of.
The victims are mostly poor girls, the perpetrators overwhelmingly men of Pakistani descent. When people raise the alarm, authorities refuse to act.
Why do you think they didn't care enough?
Because they thought they were dirty little slags.
There were serious failures in the system. Some Muslim politicians in local government allegedly threatened and intimidated non-Muslim officials and politicians. Many authorities were afraid to act because they did not want to be called racist or Islamophobic. This is not a story the UK didn't know about. This is a story the UK chose not to act on. Sadly, similar cases are still coming to light today. Hundreds of arrests connected to grooming gangs have happened as recently as 2024 and 2026. This shows that the problem continues and has not been fully solved. On a random day in 1997 in England, a British girl around 13 years old living in Gare in Rotherham, she was walking alone when a man verbally abused her on the street. And then when a British Pakistani taxi driver pulled over, Riyasat Hussain, that's his name, everything was already planned by him. And then he offered to help, promising to give her a lift to safety. It seemed kind at first, so she got in, and instead he drove her to her place. He drove her to an abandoned industrial estate and raped her. Days or weeks later, he found her again. He threatened her, manipulated her, and again he drove her to a desolate field and raped her inside his car. That girl was one of many vulnerable children targeted by taxi drivers like Hussain, who used their jobs to lure, isolate, and exploit them, often passing victims to others in the network. Court records shows this wasn't isolated. It was a part of a calculated system that abused over 1,400 girls in Rotherham alone. This is how the grooming gangs really operated, starting with a helpful offer, ending in a year of horror. In towns across England from Rotherham to Rochdale, a disturbing pattern emerged over decades. Groups of Pakistani men systematically grooming and exploiting children. These were not random acts of abuse, but organized networks operating methodically, preying on the most vulnerable. Official court records identify offenders from British Pakistani communities, including men like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, Arshid Hussain, and Sajid Mahmood. They were taxi drivers, takeaway owners, and laborers, ordinary men to their neighbors, yet they orchestrated repeated abuse against children, some as young as 11. Grooming begins with observation. Offenders identified vulnerable children, girls from broken homes, care facilities, or struggling families. They offered attention, gifts, and affection to gain trust. They isolated victims from friends and family, creating dependence and control. This psychological manipulation was as damaging as physical abuse. Shabir Ahmed, running a local taxi service, would approach girls returning from school, offering lifts, snacks, and conversation. Adil Khan, in his takeaway, provided free meals and personal attention. Arshid Hussain, as a delivery driver, transported victims to other towns, facilitating exploitation. Each man had a role, each action calculated. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison, investigating these networks, observed they knew which children were vulnerable. They planned their access, coordinated among themselves, and exploited weaknesses systematically. The grooming process often included gifts or money, creating a sense of obligation. victims were gradually coerced into sexual activity. Threats of harm, social pressure, and intimidation ensured silenced. Victims feared disbelief, retaliation, or being blamed. Networks were not isolated. Men shared information, coordinated abuse schedules, and advised each other on avoiding detection. Older offenders mentored younger men, creating a system that perpetuated itself over years. One survivor testified in court, "At first it felt like attention. Then I realized I couldn't say no. They told me no one would believe me. Every time it was planned, every time someone was watching or guiding the other." Offenders often exploited possession of trust. Taxi services, shops, and neighborhood connections provided access to children. They presented themselves as friendly, helpful, and polite, masks that hid their predatory intent. Courts emphasized that this ordinary facade was part of the grooming strategy. Victims reported being moved between multiple men, often in groups. Abuse was repeated and orchestrated, not random. Court records describe systematic patterns: grooming, manipulation, sexual exploitation, and coercion, all carefully planned. Fictionalized reenactment of offender planning. Shabir Ahmed, keep her isolated, make sure no one sees. Adil Khan, I will meet her at my shop, make it look like normal. Arshid Hussain, I will drive her where needed, keep it quiet. Investigation revealed that these networks targeted specific vulnerabilities. Children in care homes were particularly exposed. Predators identified weaknesses, lack of family support, low self-esteem, or social isolation, and used them to maintain control. Courts consistently highlighted repeat offenders. Men like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain were convicted for multiple incidents, demonstrating that grooming was organized and habitual. This was not opportunistic abuse, but deliberate, calculated exploitation. Grooming gangs operate like organized networks. They observe, plan, and exploit. Understanding their methods is the key to prevention and intervention. Offenders often included younger men, relatives or friends who learned tactics from more experienced predators. The networks taught manipulation, control, and evasion, extending the reach and duration of abuse. Victim testimony described repeated, coordinated abuse by multiple men. They recalled feeling trapped, manipulated, and terrified. Courts confirmed that grooming was a planned, systematic process designed to maintain control over victims for extended periods. Documentation collected by police, including messages, photographs, and eyewitness statements, repeated offenders were clearly identified. Courts emphasized that the grooming networks relied on coordination, secrecy, and mutual support. Now it's time for a timeline of grooming operations. Late 1990s, early signs of targeted abuse. Children in care homes reported missing or coerced. Early 2000s, networks expand. Offenders coordinated across neighborhoods. 2008, police gather intelligence on repeat offenders. Internal reports note patterns. 2010 to 2013, Crown Court conviction. Offenders sentenced for repeated sexual exploitation and grooming. Even after reports were made, many cases were delayed due to fear of political backlash or accusations of racial profiling. This allowed grooming networks to continue operating for years. Victims described the psychological impact: fear, shame, isolation, and confusion. The trauma extended far beyond the abuse itself. Grooming was a strategic tool, not only for sexual exploitation, but also for controlling victims and silencing them. Courts repeatedly highlighted the calculated nature of offenders' action. Each step, observation, manipulation, coercion, and repeated abuse was deliberate. Coordination between offenders ensured that no single adult acted alone. This network approach made detection and intervention extremely difficult. Offenders' ordinary appearances mask their crimes. Neighbors often describe them as polite, friendly, and helpful. This normalcy was deliberately allowing offenders to operate openly while concealing criminal activity. By the time authorities fully investigated, hundreds of children had already been exploited. Courts convicted many of the main offenders, including Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain. But the scale of grooming underscores the organizational sophistication and planning involved. This episode focuses on the victims, their lives, vulnerabilities, backgrounds, and how they were systematically targeted and exploited. What follows is based on what courts and official evidence have established in trials across the United Kingdom, including the Rochdale case, the Kelly case, the Peterborough case, and similar prosecutions. In the Rochdale grooming gang trial, the court identified two victims referred to only as Girl A and Girl B. Both were first contacted by the defendants when they were just 13 years old. The Crown Prosecution Service presented evidence showing that both girls came from backgrounds marked by instability, neglect, and prior interaction with social services. Court records state that they were highly vulnerable and deeply troubled, and that both girls were known to the authorities before the abuse began. Girl B had been in the care system. Records heard in Manchester Minchell Street Crown Court show she was living in a children's home when the grooming started. Evidence presented to the jury established that from her early teens, she was repeatedly offered alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, and places to stay by the men who would later sexually exploit her. Prosecutors described how her vulnerabilities was assessed and recorded by social services, yet no effective protective action was taken. At one point in court, the victim testified that her own social service file contained a description that she was loitering and prostituting from the age of 10, a label that was accepted by professionals at the time despite her age. These records were later described by the victim herself as willy and deeply damaging to her sense of self. Girl A situation was similarly marked by vulnerabilities. The prosecution told the court that she too had a troubled home environment and was easy prey for the defendants because she was seeking belonging and attention that she lacked at home. During evidence, she explained that by the age of 13, she had already been in situation with multiple older men who gave her alcohol and drugs before sex, to the extent that by her own estimate, she had been abused by dozens and potentially hundreds of men. The jury was told that she was passed around within exploitation networks after her phone number was shared among other men. Both girls were groomed through a combination of attention, material rewards, and coercion. The court heard that the perpetrators supplied them with alcohol and drugs, and that the girls, lacking stable adult support, came to trust these men as friends or protectors. This manipulation of emotional need, turning attention and gifts into control, was accepted by the jury as a deliberate tactic. Victims in other cases followed the same pattern. In the Kelly child sex abuse ring, one main victim, aged between 13 and 14 at the time of offences, was groomed by men who initially offered gifts and apparent affection before coercion her into sexual activity in parks, churchyards, and car parks. The jury at Bradford Crown Court convicted all 12 men for rape and other sexual offences based on this pattern of grooming and exploitation. In the Peterborough grooming case, victims included girls as young as 12. Court evidence showed that they were approached by older men who offered smoked tobacco, free meals, and attention. They were then encouraged to consume vodka or strong alcohol and subsequently coerced into sexual acts. The judge accepted that these girls were selected because their emotional circumstances made them vulnerable to manipulation. Across trials, courts have repeatedly described victims as socially isolated, lacking stable support system, and often already in care or known to service for other issues. Evidence tendered in court noted that some girls experience bullying at school, low self-esteem, or family breakdowns, which made them easy targets for abusers who presented themselves as friends or boyfriends before the abuse began. The exploitation of these victims was not brief. In Rochdale, the abuse lasted for years, from age 13 into later teenage years, as the girls were repeatedly raped and assaulted in filthy flats, cars, alleyways, and abandoned buildings. The court was told that the perpetrators expected sex whenever and wherever they wanted, turning these children into what the prosecution described as sex slaves. Victims also suffered long-term psychological harm. In sentencing remarks, judges noted that the profound impact on every aspect of the victims' lives, their sense of self, relationships, mental health, and trust in adults. One victim spoke in court about how the abuse destroyed her life, affecting her physical and emotional well-being years after the exploitation began. Despite these children being known to authorities, multiple court cases revealed that social services and police responses were inadequate. In some instances, professionals initially misinterpreted victims' behavior as delinquency rather than signs of exploitation, and warnings were overlooked. These institutional failings were acknowledged in court and later in public inquiries as factors in allowing abuse to continue. This is who the victims were, often girls in their early teens, known to care system or local authorities, socially isolated and emotionally vulnerable. They were targeted through a cruel combination of manipulation, substance misuse, and coercion. And once trapped, they endured repeated exploitation that profoundly affected their lives and futures. In Rotherham, South Yorkshire, a pattern emerged over more than a decade. Groups of Pakistani men systematically targeting children. These were not just isolated offenders, they were organized, connected, and repeated in their crimes. Almost all of these offenders were British citizens of Pakistani heritage. Names repeatedly appear in official reports and court records. Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, Arshid Hussain, and Sajid Mahmood. They were ordinary men, taxi drivers, takeaway owners, laborers. Yet, behind closed doors, they exploited vulnerable girls, some as young as 11 years. Shabir Ahmed ran a local taxi service. Adil Khan owned a takeaway. Arshid Hussain was a delivery driver. Each used his position to gain access to children. Victims were groomed through attention, gifts, and false affection. Threats and peer pressure were used to maintain silence. These Pakistani men rarely acted alone. They coordinated in small networks, sharing information about victims and facilitating each other's abuse. They observed vulnerabilities, identified patterns, and planned their exploitation. Jane Sr., a youth worker, documented each case. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison submitted intelligence reports on repeat offenders Both noted that these networks were methodical and deliberate. Victims were passed between offenders, abuse was repeated and planned. Courts confirmed that grooming was systematic. Younger men were often recruited into network, learning from older offenders how to manipulate and control victims. One survivor testified in court. They told me if I spoke, no one would believe me. I felt trapped, scared, and alone. Every time it was a different man, sometimes the same man, but always planned. Official investigation showed these offenders relied on silence. Families sometimes concealed abuse. Neighbors saw ordinary men polite and helpful, masking their criminal intent. This normalcy allowed predators to continue unchecked. The offenders' crimes were documented in photographs, messages, and eyewitness accounts. Courts identified repeated abuse by Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain. The offenses were not random, they were coordinated and deliberate. By the time meaningful investigation began, hundreds of girls had been abused. Convictions were eventually secured, but the scale of exploitations underscores how networks enabled prolonged abuse. Victim testimony and court findings consistently highlighted the organized nature of these crimes. Planning, coordination, and manipulation were central. Recognizing the offenders and their networks is crucial to understanding the full scope of abuse. These men were ordinary in appearance but extraordinary in harm. Their coordination, planning, and grooming allowed abuse to continue for years. Court eventually convicted many, but the system's failure to stop them sooner had devastating consequences. Understanding who these offenders were, their roles, and their network is essential. Only by acknowledging their identities can similar tragedies be prevented. In Rotherham, South Yorkshire, quiet streets and brick houses hid a terrible reality. Children were being sexually exploited for more than a decade, while the institutions meant to protect them repeatedly failed. From the late 1990s, warnings came in. Teachers noticed children missing from care. Social workers reported grooming patterns. Girls as young as 11 were being targeted. Names of repeated offenders appeared: Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, Arshid Hussain. Ordinary men, taxi drivers, takeaway owners, laborers committing extraordinary harm. Jane Senior, a determined youth worker, meticulously documented each incident, every missing child, every suspicious adult, every warning sent to council offices and police stations. But each report was met with hesitations. Notes were taken, meetings were delayed, and actions remained minimal. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison, a conscientious police officer, submitted intelligence reports and escalated concerns. He observed the same offenders repeatedly involved, yet colleagues hesitated to act. Fear of political backlash and accusations of racial profiling froze decision making at multiple levels. Sean Wright, then Director of Children's Services, prioritized the Council's reputations over child protection. While evidence mounted, decisive action was repeatedly postponed. The system designed to safeguard children failed them. By 2025, patterns were undeniable. Multiple girls reported abuse by the same man, yet senior staff avoided direct confrontation. Reports were softened, intelligence was archived uninvestigated, risk assessments failed to reflect the reality, predators operated with impunity. Repeated warnings in 2008 from care homes identified multiple offenders. Social workers and police provided detailed evidence. Still, investigations were delayed. predators remained free. The abuse continued. Institutional inertia and fear dominated every decision. Cultural and political considerations compounded the failure. Officials feared community backlash. They feared accusations of racism. Reports carefully avoided ethnic descriptors. Patterns were obscured. The result: repeated inaction despite clear evidence of harm. Whistleblowers like Jane Sr. faced resistance and isolation. Every attempt to escalate concerns was met with cautionary advice. Tread lightly. Detective Ellison recalled feeling helpless as bureaucracy and fear blocked the protection of children. Courage was stifled by political sensitivity. The 2014 J report highlighted the consequences. Over 1,400 children had been abused between 1997 to 2013. Multiple offenders were named. Repeated warnings were ignored. Leadership failed. Sean Wright resigned, but criminal accountability was limited. The system's failure were structural and repeated. The consequences were devastating. Victims grew up knowing that the adults who should have intervened did not report meetings and memos, documented what happened, but action was absent. Institutional failure was not a single mistake. It was a series of repeated avoidable decisions. Rotherham was not an isolated case. Similar failure appeared in Rochdale, Huddersfield, and elsewhere. The lesson is stark. Institutions can fail when fear, bureaucracy, or political calculation outweigh duty of care. Vigilance, courage, and accountability are essential to prevent tragedy. In the heart of South Yorkshire, the town of Rotherham seemed ordinary. Rows of brick houses, quiet streets, children playing in parks. But behind this calm, hundreds of children were being exploited, not because no one noticed, but because those meant to protect them were frozen by fear. Fear of being called Islamophobic.
And because of the perpetrators are mostly Pakistani, what that causes is that nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to address it. And that's why it got worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's why the poor victims are not getting the justice that they deserve, because there's this fear of Islamophobia. And that's what's making this situation so much worse than all of the other situations of exploitation that we see around the world.
You can say that because of your background and because of your name, although you do pay a price for it, because there are many Muslims who hate you and would gladly see you dead. Do you think it's time that English and Scots and Canadian and whatever just stop tippy-toeing around on that and we're honest about this?
We absolutely have to. We have to be able to speak. We have to be able to criticize things that need to be criticized. So this was a major part of my book. So how Western liberals empower radical Islam. They are essentially empowering the radicals when they don't want to talk about it, when they want to ignore it, when they want to sweep it under the rug. If they want to eradicate these kinds of things, what they need to do is support the reform Muslims, support the progressive Muslims, support those Muslims that are speaking out against these things. But instead, there's a fear of speaking out against extremists, and so that empowers them even more.
From 1997 onwards, warnings appeared repeatedly. Teachers, social workers, and police officers observed patterns of abuse. Girls as young as 11 were being groomed and trafficked. Names of offenders like Shabbir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Harshid Hussain appeared again and again. Among those trying to fight this was Jane Sr., a youth worker in her 40s, relentless and assertive.
What we had is a group of girls that were coming to this park and being given a little bit of alcohol, having a good time, driven around in cars, sat in cars, music playing quite loud, given cigarettes and everything free, everything at no cost. And then As grooming starts to escalate, what happens is they start to get threatened. And I remember one girl saying to me is, he knew everything about me, Jane, and all I ever knew was his nickname. He knew my family, he knew where my mum worked, he knew what my dad did. So when he threatened me with things like he was going to go to my disabled grandma's house and have a shot, he was going to rape my mum. And I believed all that. I believed it because that's what he was doing to me.
She meticulously documented each missing child and suspicious adult. She raised these concerns at every opportunity, to council meetings, to social services, to police officers, yet every warning was met with hesitation. Reports were softened, meeting delayed. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison, a conscientious officer in his 30s, filed repeated internal reports. He saw the same offenders targeted repeatedly, yet colleagues avoided pursuing leads that might implicate minority communities. The fear of being labeled racist dominated decision making, paralyzing those sworn to protect. Sean Wright, then Director of Children's Services, embodied the institutional caution. Ambitious and politically aware, he avoided taking decisive action that might provoke controversy. While evidence mounted, he repeatedly prioritized the council's reputation over child protection. By 2005, patterns were impossible to ignore. Girls reported abuse by the same man repeatedly. Yet, meetings among senior staff avoided direct discussion of offender backgrounds. Traces were carefully edited in reports. Intelligence passed to police officers was archived uninvestigated. The system meant to protect children froze. Jane Sr. and Detective Ellison both escalated concerns. Senior pleaded for action, warning that children were in immediate danger. Ellison submitted evidence naming offenders, but South Yorkshire police hesitated. They worried about accusations of racial profiling. The children waited and the abuse continued. Internal council documents later confirmed this fear of being labeled racist. Officials deliberately avoided ethnic descriptors, downplayed patterns, and softened reports. The paralysis was subtle but deadly. Whistleblowers like Jane Sr. faced isolation and resistance. She testified that raising the alarm felt like asking permission to save lives, permission that was repeatedly denied. Detective Ellison revealed that every time they tried to escalate, they were told to tread carefully. The fear of criticism outweighed the obligation to act. In 2014, Professor Alexis J. published the independent inquiry into the child sexual exploitation in Rotherham. Her findings were clear. Over 1,400 children abused between 1997 to 2013. Multiple named offenders, repeated warnings ignored, and a culture of fear paralyzing professionals. Sean Wright was named for failing to act decisively, and he later resigned. The report stated unequivocally that the fear of being labeled racist was a significant factor in delayed action. Professionals admitted under oath that patterns were visible for years, but concerns about political fallout prevented them from intervening. Meetings were held, notes were taken, yet action remained minimal. Offenders exploited this gap. The consequences were severe and widespread. When fear of public or political condemnation overrides duty of care, institutions stop functioning. The harm compounds with every delay. The cost of silence was immense. Hundreds of children were victimized while adults debated appearances. By the time investigation intensified, many victims had already endured years of abuse. Some offenders were eventually convicted, but many officials who failed to act faced little accountability. This fear did not shout, it whispered in corridors, in memos, in council chambers. And when fear governs decisions, the vulnerable are left exposed. The perpetrators noticed, they knew the system would hesitate and they exploited it. In the shadows of Rotherham and other towns, hundreds of children were being exploited while adults who should have protected them hesitated. Amidst this, a small group of individuals refused to stay silent. These were the whistleblowers, the truth tellers who risked careers, reputations, and even personal safety to expose the abuse. Jane Senior, a senior youth worker, was among the first to raise alarms. She meticulously documented repeated instances of sexual exploitation, naming offenders like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain. Her warnings, delivered to council officials and social services, were often ignored or minimized. Yet she persisted, driven by a belief that children's safety could not be compromised for a political convenience. Detective Sergeant Mark Ellison, a dedicated police officer, also fought against institutional inertia. He submitted intelligence reports, tracked repeat offenders, and advocated for investigation. He repeatedly encountered resistance. Colleagues hesitated, fearing criticism or accusations of racism. Ellison later testified that every step he had to push against an entrenched culture of avoidance. Whistleblowers were not limited to council or police staff. Teachers, social workers, and care home staff also tried to draw attention to grooming networks. Many faced hostility, isolation, or threats to their employment. Some were told their concerns were overblown or politically sensitive. Despite mounting evidence of repeated abuse, now the time of fictionalized reenactment. So this is what happened in court. Jane Senior. Every girl I recorded, every note I filed, I knew that if nothing changed, they would continue to be harmed. Social worker colleagues, we have to follow protocol, but I see it too. It's happening again. Despite the efforts of these brave individuals, the media often fail to report the scale of abuse accurately. Early investigations were sporadic. Some journalists avoiding publishing stories that might inflame ethnic tensions. Investigative reports were delayed, suppressed, or watered down under pressure from authorities or editorial concerns. One senior journalist later reflected, "We knew reports existed, but fear of backlash, accusation of racism, and potential legal consequences made it difficult to publish." Many children remained invisible while adults debate reputations and politics. The consequence of media silence was profound. Without public scrutiny, councils and police were not compelled to act. Patterns of abuse went unchallenged. Predators continued to operate. Emboldened by the lack of accountability, victims were left without a voice in the public sphere. Whistleblowers like Jane Senior continued to escalate their concerns. She raised issues in council meetings, wrote letters, and testified before internal investigations. Detective Ellison pressed for prosecution, yet their warnings were repeatedly delayed or ignored. Fear of public criticism paralyzed institutions. Eventually, inquiries such as the 2014 J reports and parliamentary hearings brought the truth to light. They confirmed that institutional inaction had allowed over 1,400 children to be exploited between 1997 to 2013. The reports acknowledged the critical role of whistleblowers who had kept records, documented offenders, and tried to compel action despite resistance. Courts recognized that without the persistence of whistleblowers, many offenders would have been remained free, and countless victims would have continued to suffer in silence. The courage of individuals like Jay Senior contrasted sharply with the inertia of institutions unwilling to risk political or reputational fallout. Media silence was not always malicious, but it had the same effect. delaying awareness, burying evidence, and protecting offenders indirectly. Early investigative pieces were restricted or toned down. Community sensitivities were cited to avoid controversies. As a result, abuse continued unnoticed by the wider public for years. Whistleblowers are the last line of defense when institutions failed, when media hesitates or censor critical reporting. Predators gain time. Courage and transparency are essential for accountability. Victims consistently testified that without whistleblowers, no one would have believed them. Their documentation became evidence for eventual prosecutions. Names like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain were eventually brought to court because someone refused to stay silent. By the early 2010, mounting pressure from whistleblowers and investigative journalists forced authorities to act. Councils were publicly criticized. Police departments faced inquiries. Convictions were obtained and some officials resigned. But the years of silence left lasting scars on victims and communities. Across the United Kingdom, grooming gang activity reached shocking levels. From the late 1990s through the early 2010s, hundreds of children were exploited, revealing a national pattern of abuse. Rotherham alone reported over 1,400 confirmed victims between 1997 to 2013. Rochdale, Huddersfield, and Oxford had similar cases, each with dozens of hundreds of victims. Repeated offenders operated in networks spanning multiple towns. The abuse was widespread, from South Yorkshire to Manchester, Bradford, and smaller towns across England and Wales. Grooming networks exploited children with alarming efficiency. Offenders traveled between towns to carry out abuse, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. Victims were primarily girls aged 11 to 16 from vulnerable backgrounds, including broken homes, care facilities, or struggling families. They were targeted for vulnerability, race, and religion. This pattern repeated across the country, enabling offenders to act wherever opportunity existed. Court records and inquiry confirmed hundreds of named offenders in each town. In Rochdale alone, 9 men were convicted in 2012 for repeated abuse. In Huddersfield, 11 men were convicted between 2005 to 2010. In Oxford, dozens more were identified. Thousands of victims across England were exploited by hundreds of offenders in coordinated networks. Offenders like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain in Rotherham show how one network could exploit dozens of children over years. Similar networks in other towns created a nationwide crisis. Investigations revealed that offenders used mobility and community connections to access children in multiple locations. Networks adapted to each area and exploited gaps in local policing and social services. Victims reported repeated grooming by multiple men, threat to silence them, and systematic manipulation. The methods were nearly identical across towns, proving a national pattern of organized abuse. Failures in communication between institutions allowed offenders to operate freely across regions. Intelligence about repeat offenders was often silenced, which extended the reach and duration of abuse. Courts confirmed that offenders were part of repeated organized abuse networks. Names like Shabir Ahmed, Adil Khan, and Arshid Hussain appear repeatedly in convictions, highlighting the role of repeat offenders in larger networks. Smaller communities also experience grooming networks. Local authorities often assumed cases were isolated, allowing offenders to act without fear of detection. Nationally, thousands of children were exploited through repeated offenses and coordinated networks. The true scale of abuse was larger than initially reported. Many victims never came forward, and institutional failures meant some cases were never investigated. Independent inquiries suggest that the number of victims may have been several times higher than early estimates. Victim testimony from multiple towns shows a consistent pattern. Girls were groomed, exploited, and passed between offenders across towns. Their accounts, combined with police evidence, reveal networks operating with coordination and efficiency. The scale of the crime became undeniable. Grooming gangs were not confined to one town or region. They operated nationwide, exploiting system failures and vulnerable children.
Police are turning a blind eye to this. The parents have gone to the police many, many times and nothing is being done.
That's right.
Right?
Yes. Every time, no pedophiles.
Anger spilling onto Britain's streets. A teenager held captive, hundreds of Sikhs on the UK streets, and a dramatic rescue. Putting the spotlight on an issue UK PM Keir Starmer hoped to cover up: the rampant menace of Pakistani grooming gangs. Over 200 members of the Sikh community took to the streets of West London to rescue a 16-year-old girl allegedly being held captive by a Pakistani grooming gang and raped by half a dozen men. Viral footage shows
Even after the convictions, inquiries, and public exposure of grooming gangs in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Huddersfield, the question remains: is this still happening today? Reports from child protection agencies and police investigations indicate that exploitations has not ended. While high-profile networks have been dismantled, offenders adapt their methods and continue to seek vulnerable children. Modern technology has changed the way grooming occurs. Social media platforms, messaging apps, and online forums allowed predators to reach children more easily than ever before, often bypassing traditional protections. Children in care homes, those experiencing family breakdowns, and those living in poverty remain at heightened risk. The patterns of targeting remain consistent: identifying vulnerability, grooming trust, isolating victims, and coercion exploitations. Authorities acknowledge progress in detection and reporting, but gaps remain. Intelligence sharing between towns and agencies has improved, yet some children remain exposed due to systemic weaknesses and under-resourced services. Victims continue to come forward, sometimes years after abuse, revealing networks that authorities had not previously identified. Repeat offenders exploit both online and offline vulnerabilities, demonstrating that the threat is ongoing. Social workers, teachers, and community members play a crucial role in identifying risk and reporting concerns. Awareness campaign and education programs aims to empower children to recognize and resist grooming behaviors. Cases today are less visible in public discourse, but investigations show that abuse persists in smaller and more covert networks. The victims' experiences are tragically similar to those from past decades: manipulation, isolation, and repeated exploitation. Efforts to prevent abuse include online monitoring, risk assessment in care facilities, and cross-agencies collaboration. However, predators continue to adapt, exploiting loopholes and gaps in protection. Child protection agencies emphasize vigilance, education, and swift intervention as the most effective tools. Communities are urged to report concerns, and institutions are encouraged to respond without delay. Despite reforms, systemic failures from the past have left long-lasting scars. Many survivors continue to suffer trauma, while perpetrators exploit remaining vulnerabilities in society. The scale may be smaller than the peak of the early 2000s, but the pattern remains consistent. Grooming continues, highlighting the need for ongoing vigilance and societal awareness. The most important lesson is clear: exploitation thrives where vigilance falters, and awareness, action, and protection are the only ways to prevent history from repeating itself.